Welcome to the Oracle's Rest, a place where stories unfold slowly, where time softens, and where the mind is free to wander. Tonight, we go in search of a lost world, a great island said to have ruled the sea, ringed by water and gleaming with strange metal. Until in a single day and a single night it slipped beneath the waves and was gone. Tonight we drift toward the oldest and most beautiful mystery of the deep, the story of Atlantis, the city that sank, the question that has never been answered. What happened to Atlantis? And did it ever truly exist at all? Picture, for a moment, a calm sea at evening. The water stretches out, flat and silver to the horizon, empty in every direction. And somewhere beneath it, the story says, lies a drowned kingdom, towers and temples and harbours resting in the dark, streets where no one walks, gates green with age, a whole world swallowed whole, sleeping now far below the reach of light. For more than 2,000 years, people have stood at the edge of the sea and wondered if such a place could be real, and where it might lie, and what it would mean to find it. Tonight, we are going to wander slowly through that wandering, and let the mystery carry us gently towards sleep. The strange thing about Atlantis, the thing most people never learn, is that the entire story comes from a single source, one man, one voice across the centuries, the Greek philosopher Plato, writing in Athens about 2,400 years ago. Before Plato, in everything that survives to us, there is no Atlantis at all, no older legend, no rival account. The lost island appears for the first time in two of his works, and from those few pages, every map, every theory, every dream of Atlantis that has ever followed has grown. It is a remarkable thing to sit with. An entire world conjured in a handful of paragraphs by one thoughtful man, long ago, and never quite allowed to sink since. It is a fragile thing when you consider it, for a whole world to rest upon. A few dozen paragraphs in two old books by one philosopher. Had those pages been lost, as so very many ancient writings were lost, burned in fires, rotted in damp, or simply never copied as the centuries turned, then Atlantis would have vanished as completely as the island itself, and no one would ever have missed it, because no one would have known there was anything to miss. Whole libraries of the ancient world are gone. Plays and histories and philosophies by the hundreds. Names we know only because someone once happened to mention them in a book that happened to survive. Atlantis lived because its pages lived. A single thread of ink, unbroken across more than 2,000 years, copied by hand from scroll to scroll, age after age, is all that holds the great island up above the waters of forgetting. And on that one thin thread, an entire dream has hung and grown and gathered to itself more wonder and longing than many things that truly happened. There is something to rest in there, in the quiet before sleep. How much a few pages can carry, how long a story can float, if only someone keeps it. Plato told the story inside two of his dialogues. The works we now call the Timaeus and the Critias, they are not adventure tales. They are philosophical conversations in which characters sit and talk through the deepest questions of the world. And into one of these conversations, the tale of Atlantis is introduced, not as a fantasy, but as something presented as ancient and true, a story handed down from long before. The setting of that conversation matters, and it is a quiet, telling thing. For the day before, the speakers had been talking about the perfect society, about what the very best city would look like, how it would be ordered, how its guardians would live, simply and justly, without greed, devoted wholly to the good of all. And one of them, having described this ideal in words, confessed a longing to see it brought to life, to see such a city not standing still, like a beautiful painting, but moving, alive, tested in some great struggle. And it is precisely there, into that longing, that the story of Atlantis arrives. One of the company says that he knows a tale, a true one. He insists, passed down in his family, of a time when a city very like that ideal truly existed and truly was tested in a war against a mighty enemy from beyond the sea. The perfect city was ancient Athens. The mighty enemy was Atlantis. So, from the very first, the lost island is born as the dark companion to a dream of goodness. It exists in the story to be the thing that goodness must stand against. That is worth holding on to as we wander because it tells us what the tale is really about long before it sinks. And the way the story is said, to have travelled is itself a kind of dream. According to Plato, the tale did not begin in Greece at all. It was carried home from Egypt. Generations earlier, a wise and famous Athenian named Solon was said to have travelled to Egypt, to an old city in the delta of the Nile. There, in conversation with the Egyptian priests, keepers of records far older than anything in Greece, Solon was told of a mighty civilization that the Greeks themselves had forgotten. The priests, the story goes, gently chided him. They told him that the Greeks were like children, with no memory of the distant past, because again and again their records had been swept away by floods and fire, while Egypt's long memory endured. And then they told him of Atlantis. So the story, as Plato frames it, is a memory of a memory. The priests told Solon. Solon, it is said, meant to make a great poem of it, but never did. The tale passed down through his family across the generations, from grandfather to grandson, until at last it reached the speakers in Plato's dialogue, who tell it as a thing remembered from childhood, carefully preserved, a story already ancient when it was first set down. There is something fitting in that. Atlantis arrives to us already wrapped in distance and time, already half lost, already a thing recalled rather than seen. Linger a moment on that Egyptian city where the tale is said to have begun. Its name was Sais, an old and quiet place in the green delta of the Nile, ancient already when Greece itself was young. The priests there served a goddess they honoured above all others, and they told Solon that this goddess was, in truth, the very same one the Athenians called Athena, so that Sais and Athens were, in a way, sister cities, founded under the care of the same divine hand, though neither had remembered the other across the long gulf of time. There is a gentleness in that idea. Two cities, far apart, secretly kin, and only an old priest left who knew it. And the priests of Sais kept records. They said, written and carved and preserved in their temples, going back thousands upon thousands of years. So when Solon tried to impress them with the oldest stories the Greeks possessed, the tales of the first men and of the great flood, their own legends dimly remembered, The priests only smiled. You Greeks. One aged priest is said to have told him, are all children. There is not an old man among you. Your souls hold no belief made grey by time, no knowledge whitened with age. You remember only one flood, when there have been many. You begin the world over and over, and each time you forget. And the reason, the priest explained, was catastrophe. For the world, he said, is destroyed and remade again and again across the long ages in many different ways. Sometimes by great floods of water, and sometimes by fire falling from the heavens. The Greeks, he noted, told a story of a boy named Phaethon who once took the reins of the chariot of the sun and could not hold its course and scorched the earth before he was struck down. The Greeks told it as a charming myth, but beneath it, the priest said, lay the memory of a real thing, of the times when the bodies of the heavens wander from their paths, and fire comes upon the earth, and much of humankind perishes in the burning. And when instead the floods come, the priest went on, it is the herdsmen and the shepherds in the high places who survive, while the cities of the plains, the cities by the rivers and the sea, the learned and lettered places where the records are kept, are swept away entirely. So with each disaster, the memory of the world is wiped nearly clean, and the few survivors begin again, knowing nothing of what came before, like children, without a past. Only in Egypt, the priest said, where the gentle Nile guarded them from the worst of both the fire and the flood, had the long thread of memory never been cut. Only there did the deep past still survive, written down, unbroken, and it was out of that long Egyptian memory, the story says, that the priest drew the tale of Atlantis. For there had been, he told Solon, a war greater than any the Greeks recalled, an age almost beyond imagining before their own. 9,000 years, he said, before Solon's own lifetime. 9,000 years. Sit a moment with that number, for it is part of what makes the story so strange and so impossible. It places Atlantis not in the dawn of history, but long before any history we know, before the first cities we have ever found, before writing, before the wheel, in a darkness so deep that no record of ours reaches anywhere near it. Whatever Atlantis is, the story sets it almost unimaginably far away in time, at the very bottom of the well of the past, and the priest set it just as far away in space. He placed the lost island beyond the edge of the entire Greek world, out past the narrow strait the Greeks called the Pillars of Heracles, the gateway we now call Gibraltar, where the inner sea pours out into the open ocean. To a Greek, that strait was the end of the map. It was the doorway out of the warm, familiar Middle Sea into the vast, dark, trackless ocean beyond, a place of fear and rumour, the edge of the known. And there, the priest said, just beyond that gateway, Atlantis had once risen from the waves, an island greater, he claimed, than the lands of Libya and Asia combined, as the Greeks then reckoned them. A mass of land larger than all the world they knew. From it, a traveller could once cross to other islands, and from those islands onward to a far opposite shore that ringed the true and outer ocean, the Middle Sea. The priest said, was a mere harbour with a narrow mouth by comparison. The real ocean lay outside, and Atlantis had been its gateway and its master, and what a thing it was. In the telling, let us go there now, gently, the way the old story does, and build the lost island again in the mind. In the beginning, the story says, the gods divided the world among themselves, each taking a portion of the earth to tend, and to Poseidon, lord of the sea, fell a certain great island, larger, it was said, than the lands of the ancient world that the Greeks knew. On this island lived a mortal woman named Plato, and Poseidon loved her. To keep her safe, he shaped the very land around her home. He raised a low hill near the centre of the island, and around that hill he carved rings, rings of water and rings of land, one inside another, alternating like ripples frozen in stone and sea. 2 rings of land and 3 of water, circling the central hill, so that no one could cross to her without passing the water. A fortress made of the landscape itself, drawn by the hand of a god. Plato and Poseidon had children. The story tells 10 sons in all, born in pairs, and Poseidon divided the island among them, but he gave the greatest share, the central region with its rings of water, to the eldest, and the eldest son was named Atlas. From him, the island took its name, Atlantis, the island of Atlas, and the great ocean that surrounded it took its name from him as well, the Atlantic. To this day, when we speak the name of that vast western ocean, we are speaking, faintly, the name of a son of the sea god from a story older than history. The name outlived the island. The name is still on every map. And the 10 sons became 10 kings and 10 royal lines, each ruling his own portion of the island, but all of them bound together under the eldest house, the house of Atlas, in which the high kingship passed down from father to son across the long generations. It was a vast realm and a populous one, and the story numbers its riches almost past believing. But for all its size, the tale keeps returning, lovingly, to the city at the center, the city of the rings. And so we will return there too, and the island, in its golden age, was a wonder. The story lingers over it lovingly, and so will we. The land was rich beyond measure. It brought forth fruit and grain and every kind of plant. Forests gave timber in endless supply. The earth held metals of every sort, and one metal above all, a strange and gleaming substance the old story calls orichalcum, said to shine with a reddish, fiery light, prized second only to gold, and now lost to us, its very nature a mystery. Herds of animals grazed the plains, and there were even elephants, the tale says, many of them moving across the island in great numbers, the largest and most gentle of beasts, at home in that abundant land. There was food in plenty for every creature, the story says, for the ones that live in marshes and lakes and rivers, and the ones that roam the mountains and the plains. And so, even the elephants, which need the most of all, never wanted for anything beneath that generous sky. At the center stood the city, and the city was built upon those rings that Poseidon had made. The people bridged the rings of water, so they could pass from one to another. They dug a great canal from the sea inland to the outermost ring, so that ships could sail directly into the heart of the city. They cut channels between the rings and roofed some of them over, so that boats could pass beneath the land from one ring of water to the next, gliding through tunnels of stone. Picture that, a harbour within a harbour within a harbour. Ships moving in slow circles through a city built like a target, laid upon the sea. The masts gliding past walls of stone. The water always near, and they face those walls with metal and with coloured stone. The island gave up rock of 3 colours, white and black and red, and with these the people built, weaving the colours together so that the walls themselves were patterned and bright. The outermost wall they covered with bronze, the next with tin, gleaming silver, and the innermost wall around the central citadel they sheathed in that strange orichalcum so that it glowed, the story says, with a fiery red light, a city of ringed water and patterned stone, its heart wrapped in shining metal, catching the sun. It is a vision almost too rich to be real, and perhaps that is the point. It was meant to dazzle. At the very centre, on the old hill where Plato had lived, stood a sacred precinct, walled in gold, and within it rose a great temple to Poseidon, the god who had made the place. The temple was vast and strange to Greek eyes, covered on the outside in silver, with pinnacles of gold. Inside, the ceiling was ivory, worked with gold and silver and orichalcum, and the walls and pillars gleamed with the same. And there stood a statue of the god himself, so tall that its head nearly brushed the roof. Poseidon standing in a chariot drawn by winged horses, surrounded by 100 sea nymphs riding on dolphins. Around the temple were the springs, 2 of them, one of cold water and one of hot, flowing endlessly from the earth, and the people built baths and gardens and fountains around them, and channeled the warm water even to groves of trees. The story goes on, patient and precise, as if the teller could see it. From the sea, a great canal ran inland to the outermost ring of water, wide and deep enough for the largest ships to sail straight up into the city. A channel cut for miles through the land, where the rings of water lay between the rings of land. The people raised bridges of stone to cross them, broad enough for traffic to pass, and at each bridge they set towers and gates to guard the way, and they tunnelled passages through the rings of land themselves, roofed over with stone, wide enough and high enough that ships could glide beneath the land, from one ring of water to the next, passing out of the sun into cool darkness and out again into the light. Into the rings of land they hollowed docks and boathouses, and filled them with vessels and with all the gear and stores of a great navy. And the harbours, the story says, were crowded with ships and with merchants come from every corner of the world, so many that all day and all night there rose from the rings of water a clamour of voices and a din of traffic, the ceaseless noise of a city that never fell entirely silent. Around the greatest ring of land ran a racecourse, a full circle, where horses ran, sweeping all the way around the city, and everywhere stood the houses of the guards, the most trusted of them set nearest the citadel at the centre, watching over the sacred heart of the island, and the two springs fed the whole of it, the cold spring and the hot, flowing without end. The people led the water into open pools and into roofed bathhouses, with warm baths in winter and cool ones in summer. There were baths set apart for the kings, and baths for ordinary people, and baths kept separate for women, and even troughs and pools for the horses and the beasts of burden, each given its proper place. And the water that overflowed they carried by aqueduct across the bridges to the outer ring, and let it run into the grove of Poseidon, where, in the rich soil and the gentle air, trees of every kind grew tall and beautiful. A whole city, watered and green, ringed by harbours, loud with trade by day and quiet only in the deepest part of the night. Imagine for a little while an ordinary morning in that city, long before anything had gone wrong. The light comes up over the eastern sea and finds the outer wall first, the bronze along its top catching fire in the dawn. Then the silver of the second wall begins to shine, and last, deep in the heart of the city, a slow red glow wakes along the orichalcum around the central citadel, as if the island itself were slowly opening its eyes. The harbour is already awake. Boats slide out through the roofed channels into the open rings. Fishermen and ferrymen and traders, oars dipping, voices calling across the water from one boat to another. Smoke rises from 1,000 morning fires. The hot spring steams gently in its garden. On the bridges, people cross from ring to ring, carrying baskets, leading animals, pausing to talk above the moving water below. The long, race course lies, empty and bright with dew, and in the dim cool of the great temple, the statue of the sea god stands as it always stands. The winged horses caught mid-stride, the 100 dolphins caught mid-leap, waiting out another quiet morning as they have waited out 10,000 mornings before. It is a living city. That is the thing to hold gently in the mind. Not a ruin, not yet. A place where people woke and worked and quarrelled and loved and grew old, where children were born and named, where no one walking the bridges in the morning sun ever dreamed that one night the whole of it would go down into the dark together. Beyond the city stretched a vast plain, smooth and level, sheltered from the north winds by mountains. The story says, mountains famed for their beauty, with many wealthy villages and rivers and lakes and meadows. And the people of Atlantis in those early days were said to be wise and gentle and good. They did not prize their wealth. They held their gold lightly. The story tells, knowing that riches grow only with virtue, and that both are lost together when either is grasped too tightly. They were temperate, they were kind. The divine blood of Poseidon ran strong in them, and while it did, they lived in a kind of harmony that the story describes almost with longing. A golden age, a people at peace with their abundance, the most blessed kingdom under the sun, and they were bound to one another, the 10 kings, by a covenant older than any of them, the laws of Poseidon himself, which the first kings had set down and inscribed upon a pillar of orichalcum that stood in the very heart of the great temple. By those laws the kings ruled and judged and kept their peace with one another. And to renew the covenant, they came together at the temple every 5th year, and then every 6th, turning by turns so that the odd count and the even were each given their due. And the manner of their gathering was solemn and ancient and strange. For in the sacred precinct of Poseidon, bulls were left to roam free. And when the kings assembled, they came alone, without servants or soldiers, and they carried no iron, no blade, no weapon of any kind, but only staves of wood and woven nooses of cord. And so armed, they hunted the bulls through the holy ground. Whichever bull they took, they led to the pillar of orichalcum, and there, over the top of it, above the sacred writing, they made their sacrifice so that the blood ran down across the laws. Then they filled a great bowl with wine and cast in a drop of blood for each of them, and cleansed the pillar and drew the mixture into golden cups and poured it upon the fire, and swore by the laws written there to judge with justice and to obey, and never to take up arms against one another, but to come to one another's aid should anyone ever try to overthrow the line of Atlas. And then, as the day failed, they put out every fire in the temple and robed themselves in the deepest blue, and sat together through the night in the darkness, among the cooling embers of the sacrifice. And there they gave and received judgment. And when the dawn came at last, they wrote down the judgments they had passed upon a tablet of gold, and laid it up in the temple with their robes as a memorial, while they kept that covenant, and the divine nature was still strong in them. They prospered, and the island flourished. It was only when that nature began to fail that the long fall began, and it is hard, drifting through this gleaming vision, not to feel the weight of what the story is doing. There is a sweetness to it, and also a sadness, because we know, even as the towers rise in our minds, that they are going to fall. Every detail of the splendor is shadowed by what is coming. The brighter Atlantis shines, the more we feel the dark water waiting. That is the deep magic of the tale. It builds a paradise only to drown it, and it lets us feel both the building and the drowning at once, because the golden age did not last. Slowly, across many generations, the story says the people of Atlantis changed. The divine portion in them grew thin, diluted, mingled too often with mortal weakness, until at last it faded. And as it faded, the old virtues went with it. The people who had once held their wealth lightly began to grasp it. They grew proud. They grew greedy. They were filled, the story says, with unrighteous ambition and a lust for power. The kingdom that had been content turned outward, hungry, and set out to conquer. For Atlantis, in the tale, was not only beautiful, it was mighty. It commanded a great empire, ruling over many other islands and stretches of coast. And from its ringed harbours it could send out a navy of staggering size. Thousands of ships, the story claims, and great hosts of soldiers and chariots. And in its pride, this empire reached across the sea to swallow the lands of the Mediterranean, pressing eastward, subjecting peoples as it came, until it threatened the whole of the known world. And here the story turns, and a hero appears, and the hero is Athens. Not the Athens that Plato knew, but a far older Athens, an ideal city of long ago, brave and just and disciplined. When the armies of Atlantis came, the story says the other peoples fell or surrendered, one after another, but Athens stood. Athens alone refused. And in the end, against impossible odds, the ancient Athenians broke the power of Atlantis, freed the conquered lands, and turned back the tide of the great island empire. It is, in part, a story Athens told about itself, a story of virtue standing firm against overwhelming pride and prevailing, and the story lingers, too, on who those older Athenians were, and the picture it paints is the very opposite of gleaming Atlantis. Their land, the tale says, was once far richer than the thin and stony ground the Greeks knew in Plato's day. For long ago, before the floods wore it away, deep, good soil covered the hills of Attica, and great forests grew where later there was only bare rock. What remained in Plato's time, the story says, was like the bones of a body wasted by sickness. All the soft, rich earth washed away into the sea, leaving only the bare frame of the land behind. It is one of the most haunting images in the whole tale, the idea that even the ground beneath Athens was the worn remnant of a richer, older world. And on that older land, the story says, there lived a noble people, not rich, not splendid, but good. A class of guardians dwelt apart on the heights of the city, holding their property in common, wanting no gold, seeking no luxury, devoting themselves wholly to courage and to justice, and to the care of all the others. They were the living image of that ideal city the speakers had dreamed of the day before, plain, disciplined, brave. And it was these people, the story says, who stood against the gorgeous might of Atlantis when it came, and held, and won, the simple against the splendid, the temperate against the proud. It is not hard to see which side the storyteller admired, but the story does not end with a battle. it ends with the sea. For after the war, the tale says, there came violent earthquakes and floods, a convulsion of the earth beyond anything in memory, and in a single terrible day and night, the warriors of that ancient Athens were swallowed by the earth, and Atlantis, in that same day and night, sank beneath the sea, the whole great island, the rings, the city, the gleaming temple, the plain and the mountains, all of it gone, drowned in a moment, vanished beneath the waters of the ocean that bore its name. And the story adds one last haunting detail: the place where Atlantis had stood, it says, became for a long age afterward an impassable barrier of mud just below the surface, left behind as the island settled into the deep, so that no ship could sail there, and the sea itself seemed to close over the wound and keep its secret. A whole civilization reduced to a shoal of mud and a memory, the most blessed kingdom under the sun, gone in a night, with only the priests of Egypt to remember it, and only the pages of one philosopher to carry it down to us. That is the tale. And the moment we step back from it, the questions begin. Because the first and largest question is the simplest. Was any of it real? Did such an island ever rise from the sea and sink back into it? Or did Plato invent the whole thing? From the rings of water to the gleaming metal, as a story to make a point. Most scholars, for a long time now, have leaned toward the second answer. They see Atlantis not as history, but as a parable, a teaching tale, dressed in the costume of ancient memory. And when you look at where the story sits in Plato's work, this reading grows strong. Plato was a philosopher above all, and he loved to teach through myth. Again and again in his writings, he tells invented stories to illuminate an idea, vivid fictions that carry a truth larger than fact. And the tale of Atlantis fits this pattern almost perfectly. It is a story about pride and downfall, about a powerful, wealthy nation that loses its virtue and is destroyed, about a simpler, more disciplined people who stand against it and endure. It reads, many have argued, as a warning, a meditation on what makes a society good, and what happens when it forgets. And notice what truly destroys Atlantis in the tale. It is not the sea. The sea comes only at the very end, almost as an afterthought, finishing in a single night what had already long been undone. What ruins Atlantis is Atlantis. Its fall begins not when the waters rise, but when the goodness drains away, when the people stop holding their wealth lightly and begin to clutch at it, when temperance gives way to appetite and contentment to ambition, and the divine portion in them thins to nothing. By the time the earthquakes come, the island is already lost, already hollow, already fallen in every way that truly matters. The drowning only makes visible at last what had been happening invisibly, slowly, across the generations, in the hearts of the people. That is the quiet warning folded inside all the wonder, that the things which undo us are seldom the sudden catastrophes we fear. They are the slow changes we fail to notice, the small daily surrenders of what was best in us, until one night the sea comes for a city that was, in truth, already gone. And yet there is a gentleness hidden in that hard lesson when you turn it the other way around. For if ruin is built slowly, then so is its opposite. The good, too, is made quietly, day by day, in small and unremarkable choices, the way the first people of Atlantis built their long harmony before they ever began to lose it. There is a telling clue in this direction, too. Plato's own most famous student, the philosopher Aristotle, is said to have doubted the tale entirely. There is a line attributed to him, passed down through later writers, suggesting he thought the man who invented Atlantis was also the man who sank it, that the island was conjured and destroyed by the same hand, the hand of its author, because the story needed it to vanish. It is the oldest known note of skepticism about Atlantis, and it comes from the next generation, from someone who knew Plato well, the man who made it. Aristotle seems to say, also made it disappear. And there is something stranger still, something that gives the whole tale an air of quiet mystery, quite apart from whether it was ever true. For Plato never finished telling it. He began a second account, the dialogue we call the Critias, meaning, it seems, to set down the entire history in full, the city and the kings, the covenant and the bull, the war and the fall, and he carried it a long way. He built the rings and the temple and the gleaming walls in patient detail, He described the kings and their solemn rite. He brought the story all the way to its turning point, to the moment when the gods themselves take notice of how far Atlantis has fallen from its early goodness. He wrote of Zeus, father of the gods, looking down upon the corrupted kingdom and resolving that it must be brought low, and gathering all the gods together into their most sacred dwelling to pronounce the judgment. And Zeus, the text says, stood in the midst of them and spoke and said, and there the words stop in the middle of the sentence. The god rises to speak the doom of Atlantis, and the dialogue simply ends and is never taken up again. Plato set it down and never returned to it, and no one knows why. Whether he meant to finish and was prevented, whether he lost the thread, whether he judged he had said enough, but the effect across all the centuries since is uncanny. The story of the drowned world is itself, in a sense, drowned, cut off in the act of telling, swallowed at the very moment of judgment, just as the island was swallowed by the sea. The last thing we are given is a God rising to speak, and then silence and deep water and no more. And yet the story has never quite let go of us. And there are reasons for that beyond its beauty. Because Plato, even if he was inventing, did not invent in a vacuum. He lived in a world that knew the sea could take a city. And there are real events, real disasters that may have flowed into the tale and given it its terrible weight. Consider that only a few years before Plato wrote, a real Greek city had vanished beneath the water, and it had done so almost exactly as Atlantis does in the story. The city was called Helic. It stood on the coast not far from the heart of Greece, a prosperous place, an important one. And one winter night, around the time Plato was a grown man, an earthquake struck it, and then the sea rushed in, and in a single night, Helic was swallowed. The whole city slid beneath the waves of the Gulf, drowned and lost. For centuries afterward, people said you could still see its ruins beneath the water on calm days. A sunken town just below the surface, its temple still standing in the depths. Plato would have known this story. It was recent. It was real. A city lost in a night to earthquake and flood, just as Atlantis was, it is hard to believe the memory of Helic did not pour into the story of the sinking island, and there may be older echoes still. Far to the south of Greece, in the Aegean Sea, lies a small ring of islands that are the shattered remains of a single, larger one. Long ago, perhaps 1,000 years before Plato, that island was whole, and it held a flourishing civilization, one we now associate with the Minoans, a people of palaces and ships and art, centered on nearby Crete. And then the island's heart, a great volcano, erupted in one of the most violent explosions in human history. The center of the island collapsed into the sea. Enormous waves spread out across the Aegean, and the brilliant sea culture of that age was shaken and declined, and in time was largely forgotten. A wealthy island civilization, a great volcanic catastrophe, the sea pouring into the void. Some have wondered whether a faint, distorted memory of that real disaster, carried down through the centuries, might lie somewhere beneath the dream of Atlantis as well. We cannot know. But the shape of it rhymes, and there is one more real drowning worth setting gently beside the dream, far to the east, where the inner seas give way to the broad waters we now call the Black Sea. Some scientists believe that thousands of years ago, that sea rose with frightening speed. In the deep past, they think it may have been a smaller, lower lake, ringed by land where people lived and farmed and fished. And then the rising ocean breached the narrow barrier that held it back, and water came pouring through, and the lake swelled and spread, climbing its shores, drowning a wide rim of low country where generations had made their homes. The idea is debated, and the truth of it uncertain. But some have wondered whether the memory of such a flood, carried mouth to mouth down the long ages, might be one of the seeds of the great flood stories that appear in so many of the world's oldest tales. Another real catastrophe, perhaps feeding the long human dream of a world lost beneath the waters. So, perhaps Atlantis is woven from real threads after all, even if the island itself never was. A memory of Helic, a shadow of the volcano, the long Greek knowledge that the sea is patient and that what it wants, it eventually takes. Plato building his parable, may have reached for these true and terrible things, and the truth in them is part of why the story still grips us. It feels possible because, in pieces, it was. And there is one small, strange thread that turned out, in our own time, to be realer than anyone expected. The gleaming metal of the story, the orichalcum that sheathed the innermost wall and bore the sacred laws, was already a mystery in Plato's day. Its name means something like the copper of the mountains, and the old writers spoke of it as a precious thing, second only to gold. And then it faded from the world, until no one was quite sure it had ever been more than a poet's invention. But about 10 years ago, divers exploring an ancient shipwreck off the coast of Sicily, a vessel that had gone down more than 2,500 years ago, brought up dozens of gleaming ingots from the sea floor. And when metallurgists studied them, they found a bright alloy of copper and zinc, and they connected it by its old name to the orichalcum of legend. So, the fabled metal of Atlantis turned out to name a real substance after all, real enough to be cast into bars and carried in the hold of a ship and lost and drowned and raised again from the bottom of the sea, thousands of years later, into the light. The island may be a dream. The metal, it seems, was not, and for many centuries, that might have been the end of it. A philosopher's parable, discussed by scholars, half forgotten by the world. For a very long time, Atlantis slept quietly in old books, and few people thought of it at all. The tale survived, copied and preserved, but it did not yet have the hold on the imagination that it has now. That came much later. That came almost in our own age, though there was one earlier stirring, gentle and telling, worth a moment, centuries ago, as Europe rediscovered the old Greek writings. The name of Atlantis began to glow again, not as a place to be found, but as a dream to be borrowed. A famous thinker of that age wrote a small, unfinished book about an imagined perfect society, an island of wisdom and science and peace hidden somewhere in the unknown ocean. And he called it the New Atlantis. He did not mean that Plato's island was real. He meant that the name had become a kind of vessel for our hopes, a word for the ideal place, the better world, the society we wish we could reach. And there is a quiet echo in the fact that his book, too, was left unfinished, breaking off before its end, as if the perfect island always slips away just before we arrive. From then on, Atlantis lived a double life. It was a lost place, perhaps somewhere in the past, but it was also a word for any longed-for perfection, any golden country just over the horizon of the possible. The great revival of Atlantis, the moment it leapt out of the philosophy books and into the dreams of millions, came only a little more than a century ago. In the late 1800s, a writer set out to argue in a thick and passionate book that Atlantis had been entirely real, that it was the source of all the world's great civilizations, that the myths of floods and lost paradises found all around the globe were memories of its destruction. The book was full of bold claims and shaky evidence, and scholars did not accept it. But it did not matter. The book caught fire in the popular imagination. It was read everywhere, and from it grew the whole vast modern world of Atlantis. The endless theories, the expeditions, the maps, the searches that continue to this day. And once the dream was awake, it would not go back to sleep. People began to look for Atlantis everywhere. In the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, where Plato seemed to place it, beyond the strait the Greeks called the Pillars of Heracles, the gateway we now call Gibraltar, in the islands of the Azores, imagined as the mountain tops of the drowned land, off the coast of Spain, in a marshy region where some thought the rings of the city might still be traced from the air, in the Aegean, among the Minoan ruins. Some looked as far afield as the far north, or the Caribbean, or even the ice of Antarctica. Wherever there was a mystery, someone proposed Atlantis as the answer. The lost island became a kind of empty vessel into which people poured whatever they most wanted to find. And in becoming the answer to every mystery, Atlantis became something else as well. It became, perhaps, the most famous place that never was. There are real cities, real kingdoms, real peoples who once filled the earth and are now truly forgotten, their names erased, their stories lost beyond any recovery. And here is a place that may never have existed at all. And yet, nearly everyone has heard of it. It has appeared in more books than most real nations. It has been drawn on maps that openly admit they are only guessing. It has filled stories and songs and paintings, and in our own time, films and games beyond counting, a sunken kingdom of domes and towers, and gleaming light that millions of people can picture in an instant, though no human eye has ever seen it. Atlantis won a strange kind of immortality, and it won it precisely by never being found. A thing discovered can be measured and labelled and set upon a shelf. A thing forever just out of reach stays alive. The island's permanence is made out of its absence. It endures because it is missing. None of these searchers has ever found it. No drowned city of concentric rings has ever been raised from the sea. No gleaming orichalcum walls. No temple of Poseidon. No plain ringed by mountains beneath the waves. After more than a century of looking, with ships and sonar and divers and satellites, the great island remains exactly where Plato left it, just out of reach, just beyond the edge of the known, sunk forever in the deep water of the story. And perhaps that is where it belongs. The searching itself has a long romance to it, and its own gallery of ghosts. Every generation has brought new tools to the hunt, and new false dawns. Ships have dragged their instruments across the sea floor, listening for the straight lines of walls. Divers have gone down to investigate shadows marked on the charts. Submersibles have crept along the dark ocean bottom, their light sweeping over rock that, for one heart-stopping moment, looked almost made by hands, and again, the sea has offered up shapes that turned out to be only itself. Off one warm island, a long line of great squared stones lies beneath the shallow, clear water, set out so evenly that many were sure it was a sunken road. A last paving of Atlantis, running down into the deep. But the patient eyes of geologists found it to be a natural thing, flat rock laid down in sheets along an old shore and cracked by time into neat blocks. The slow work of the sea and not of any hand. The earth is full of such accidents, shapes that happen to mimic design, and the longing for Atlantis has a way of seeing cities in them. It is a gentle kind of haunting, this readiness to find the lost island in every strange shadow under the water. It tells us less about the sea floor than about ourselves, about how badly we want the story to be true, about how the mind keeps reaching out across the dark water. Again and again, hoping its fingers will close at last on something solid. So, the honest answer, the one the careful searchers always return to, is that Atlantis has never been found, most likely, because there is nothing there to find. No drowned kingdom of rings waits beneath the ocean. The sea floor has been mapped, and it holds mountains and plains and trenches, and no sunken city among them. And yet the looking does not stop. And perhaps it never will. And there is something tender rather than foolish in that. People keep searching for Atlantis for the very same reason they keep telling the tale, because they do not want it to be only a lesson, because a part of us wants the Golden Island to have been real, wants there to have been once. Somewhere, a place that good and that beautiful, even if it was lost. The search is a kind of hope, wearing the clothes of science. And perhaps the words that haunt the story most are also the simplest. One day and one night. In a single day and a single night, the tale says, it was gone, not worn slowly away across the centuries, the way real coastlines are worn, not abandoned little by little, the way real cities empty and fall, but taken whole in the space of one turning of the earth, between one sunset and the next. There is a particular weight in that, and a strange mercy too, the weight of how fast it must have come, and the mercy, perhaps, that it was swift, that the great city did not linger and crumble for ages, but simply, in one night, lay down beneath the sea. We will never know what that night was truly like, because most likely it never came. But the imagining of it is part of what the story leaves us with. The lights of the city, and then the dark water, and almost nothing in between. Yet something curious has happened along the way, something gentle and worth resting on. In the long search for the city that never was, people have found a great many cities that truly were. Real drowned places, real lost worlds beneath the water, and these are, in their own quiet way, even more wonderful than the dream, because they are real, and you can touch them, and the sea really did take them. There is, off the southern coast of Greece, a place where you can swim above the streets of a town that sank more than 3,000 years ago. The walls are still there beneath the clear water, the outlines of houses, the courtyards, the lanes, a whole Bronze Age town laid out on the sea floor in the shallows, so well preserved that you can drift above it and trace where people lived and walked. It is one of the oldest submerged towns ever found. No one needed to invent it. The sea simply rose, or the land simply sank, and a real town slipped quietly under, and there it has waited ever since, its streets open to the fish and the light. There is the memory of Helic itself, the city that fell in a night, which for a long time was thought to be only a legend, until in our own time its remains were finally located, buried not under open sea, but under the silt of the shifting coast. A real lost city found at last, just where the old writers said it had drowned. There is, in the warm waters of the Caribbean, a sunken town that slid beneath the sea in an earthquake only. A few centuries ago, a whole busy port gone under in minutes. Now, a quiet ruin on the seabed. There are temple cities along the coast of India said to have been swallowed by the waves, where divers have found stoneworks beneath the water near old and holy shores. And there is, beneath the cold grey waves of the North Sea, between the lands we now call Britain and the European mainland, the strangest lost world of all. For there was once a country there, not a city, but a whole land, a wide, low plain of hills and rivers and forests and marshes, where people hunted and fished and lived for thousands of years, back when the seas were lower and the ice was only beginning to melt, and then, slowly, over centuries, the rising sea crept in and drowned it, field by field, valley by valley. The land went under, until at last it was all sea, and the people had to leave, and the memory of their country faded entirely from the world. Fishermen still sometimes pull up ancient bones and worked stone from the bottom there, relics of a drowned land that no story remembers. A real Atlantis, with no Plato to keep its name. It lies beneath the waves still, silent, anonymous, vast. So the sea is full of lost worlds. That is the deep truth the dream of Atlantis points toward. Even if the island itself is only a story, the water has swallowed real towns and real lands and real lives over and over across the long ages of the earth. and it keeps them hidden and quiet beneath the moving surface. Every coastline is a little younger than it looks. Every shallow sea may hide the ghost of a shore where people once stood. The story of Atlantis is, in a sense, a single bright dream standing in for 1,000 real and forgotten ones. And maybe that is why it will not die. It speaks a truth even where it is false. The sea does take cities. The sea is full of sleeping places. We were right to wonder, and there is, perhaps, one more reason the story holds us so. Atlantis is not only a lost place, it is a lost golden age. A vision of a time when people were wiser and gentler and better than they are now, living in harmony and abundance. Before pride spoiled everything and the waters came, almost every culture, somewhere in its old stories, holds a dream like this, a memory of a paradise that was lost, a better world that slipped away, the garden we were sent out of, the age of gold that gave way to lesser ages. Atlantis wears the costume of history, but it touches something older than history. A quiet ache we seem to carry for a perfection we feel we once had and somehow let fall. When we mourn the drowned island, we are partly mourning that, the sense that something fine was here and is gone, and lies now just beyond our reach, beneath deep water, and there is comfort, strangely, in thinking of the sea as a keeper of things, and not only a destroyer. We tend to think of the ocean as that which swallows and erases, and it does, but it also holds. What goes down into the deep does not simply cease to be. It rests there in the cold and the dark and the stillness, often better kept than anything left above in the air, and the light to weather and crumble away. That drowned town off the Greek coast is more whole in its way than the cities that stayed dry and were built over and torn down 100 times. The sea took it, yes, but the sea also kept it, almost exactly as it was, for 3,000 years. And so, when we imagine Atlantis resting in the depths, we need not picture only ruin. We can picture preservation, a world held safe, in a strange way, by the very thing that took it, stilled, but not destroyed, kept. And perhaps That is the quiet gift the long dream of Atlantis offers. Here at the soft edge of sleep, the reassurance that nothing is ever wholly lost, that what sinks is not annihilated but stored away. Somewhere deep, somewhere out of reach, waiting in the dark. The golden age is not gone, it is only underwater. The better world we seem to half remember is not destroyed, it is only sleeping. Far below, where the currents move slowly and no light reaches, kept whole and safe until some bright morning that may never need to come. Let the mind rest there a while, gently, in the blue and the quiet. Imagine, if you like, that the story is true, just for tonight, just for the soft space before sleep. Imagine the great island as it was in its golden age, the rings of calm water, one inside another, the patterned walls of white and black and red stone, the bronze and the silver and the fiery glow of orichalcum catching the last of the evening light. Ships gliding slowly through the harbours, beneath the bridges, through the roofed channels in the stone. The hot springs steaming softly in their gardens, the great temple, silver and gold on its golden hill, the statue of the sea god within, the winged horses, the dolphins, the wide plain stretching out to the gentle mountains, the villages, the rivers, the herds, the elephants moving slowly across the grass. A whole world, blessed and peaceful, glowing on the surface of the sea. And then imagine the quiet that came after, the water closing over it all, soft and final, the towers going dark beneath the waves, the streets filling with cool blue silence, the gleaming walls dimming as the light fades downward, red, then green, then deep blue, then black, and the city settling slowly into the dark and the cold, where the currents move without sound, and the great temple stands empty in the depths, and the rings of water become, at last, only the sea. It is not a frightening thought. Somehow, in the hush of night, it is almost peaceful. A city laid down to rest beneath the waves. A world that does not need anyone to find it. The fish drift through the gates. The slow currents move down the silent streets. The cold, clean water keeps everything just as it was, forever. Far below the storms, far below the ships, far below the reach of the sun. Whatever was lost is held now in the deep, undisturbed, sleeping. And we, on the surface, drift on. We tell the story again, as people have for 2,400 years, around fires, in books, in the dark before sleep. We wonder, as Solon is said to have wondered, and as Plato wondered, and as everyone since has wondered, whether it was ever real and where it lies, and what it would mean, and we never quite answer. And perhaps that is the gift of it. Some stories are meant to be solved. This one is meant to be carried like a smooth stone in the pocket, turned over and over in the hand, never used up. The lost island, the sunken kingdom, the most blessed place under the sun, gone beneath the water in a single night, long ago, waiting in the deep, where the light cannot reach. The sea grows still now, the horizon fades. The story settles, like the city, gently downward into the quiet places of the mind. There is nothing more to find tonight. There is only the water, dark and calm, moving slowly over everything it keeps, somewhere far below. The rings of water have become the sea. The walls have gone soft with age. The fiery metal has dimmed to green and silver in the dark, and the city sleeps as it has slept for longer than memory, untroubled, complete, beyond all searching. The waves move on across the surface. The light withdraws. The deep holds its secret and asks for nothing. Water over stone, silence over streets. The slow currents, drifting, the lost world, resting, and far above it, the sea, going quietly on into the night.